And one of the things we worked on was a natural counteracting protein called follistatin. And follistatin, which you find in very high doses in eggs, actually can help inhibit and suppress myostatin activity and help build muscle. That's why eggs are such a cornerstone of good nutrition.
Dr. Bob Hariri, you are the man when it comes down to what is up and coming in the world of longevity in general, regenerative medicine, all kinds of different things. What would you say the 4 pillars of longevity are?
After today's video, I popped a link down below for 25% off of Seed's Daily Synbiotic. Now, when we're talking about the world of fat loss, we're talking about the world of changing your diet, a lot of it does start in the gut. So that link down below is for 25% off their Daily Synbiotic, which is a prebiotic and a probiotic. And the realm of gut microbiome research is so unbelievably insane. Like, it is so cool. There's so much going on, and Seed has published a lot of their own clinical trials. They put their money where their mouth is with that stuff, and that is truly what I appreciate about them. So I don't generally recommend random probiotics. I think the only one I've ever recommended on this channel is Seed, and it's been for a number of years. So that link is for 25% off down below. If you're trying to change your diet, trying to remodel your gut microbiome, Seed probably makes the most sense because it's, in my opinion, the most vetted probiotic that's out there. So that link is in the top line of the description for 25% off just beneath this video.
You know, Tom, that's a question that I've been asked for the last 30 years, and I sort of summarized it this way. What matters as we age is if you can maintain a level of performance that spans across systems in your body and impacts your overall quality of life. So I always reduced it to maintaining high performance mobility, which is a function of your muscle tissue and your joints. High performance cognition, your brain's got to work so you can interact with your environment effectively. High performance immunity, so your immune system can do its job, protecting you against threats and also driving all the recovery processes that are necessary. And then youthful aesthetics. And so, you know, people say, well, geez, Bob, where does youthful aesthetics fit in all this? Well, the impact of maintaining those aesthetics allows you to compete with your peers, and it allows you to enjoy a quality of life that we often lose when we begin to see ourselves as declining.
That's an interesting point. Yeah, you don't usually look at, that changes the lens in which you look at your entire life, right?
Yeah.
I look old. I don't want to go move. I don't want to, maybe I am old. I don't want to do this anymore. And then all of a sudden, all the trickle-down effects of that. So if we hone in on kind of all of these, the mobility piece is interesting because I can see from a couple of different ways how that could be surface level, really good for longevity, but also at a very core, deeper level, right? I mean, you're going through an entire range of motion for mitochondrial health, for muscle function, for all kinds of metabolic effects, right? I mean, that's can you kind of elaborate a little bit more on that pillar specifically?
You know, you're the poster boy for maintaining high quality muscle as kind of almost like your signature as a focus for your health. And here's what I know. If you go back 35 years when I was really focused on the neurosurgical treatment of traumatic brain injury and spinal cord injury, we recognized that even short periods of immobility cause tremendous loss of quality lean muscle mass. Like an 18-year-old kid in a car accident who was on an ICU could literally lose so much muscle mass that in 2 or 3 weeks, unconscious, when they woke up, they didn't have the ability or the strength to even lift their head off the bed. So I got very interested in muscle and began to look at, all the roles that it plays. Aside from force generation, you pointed out all the time, it's the principal metabolic driver of our system during our lifetime. People don't realize it. Muscle makes up 50% of the wet body mass of the average individual. So it's an enormous metabolically active organ and an enormous synthetic organ. It produces its own, what we call the myokinome. Myokinome basically means all the proteins and peptides and factors that muscle produces span a range of activities, and they influence brain function, they influence cardiac function, they influence immunity. And then the other thing which got me excited, and many, many years ago, I got really interested in a protein called myostatin, which we can talk about later. But what I realized was during our lifetime, the one actionable area where we can maintain a synthetic apparatus to serve the quality of our health is muscle tissue, right? You can do things to maintain quality and mass. And there was one study which drove it home to me. About 20 years ago, the Karolinska Institute, which is the Mayo Clinic of Europe, published a study where they followed 9,000 men for 25 years, and they tried to relate body mass index, BMI, and risk for dying from cardiovascular or cancer or other diseases. You know what they found? They found that it wasn't correlated. What was correlated, if you could maintain your muscle mass and strength, even if you technically are obese, if you maintain it into your 70s and 80s, you had a dramatically reduced chance of dying from cancer or heart disease. Far better predictor than BMI. So that's why muscle became a huge focus for me.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at muscle in general, not only from a metabolic side, but I think there's a lot more to it than that. Just because obviously there's a cardiac function as well. The more muscle that you carry, then every time you move, right, you're using more of your cardiac system.
Exactly.
You've got, if you reference even from a non-exercise activity thermogenesis side, it's like muscle at rest doesn't burn that many more calories, but when it's in motion, it's ridiculous, right? So it's an exorbitant amount. So when you start understanding, okay, hey, if I'm just going through my daily mundane tasks, but you're carrying a metabolic apparatus with you,
right?
The amount of sheer calories that you're burning, the amount of sheer blood flow, the amount of sheer, you name it, right? It's just you're moving a bigger unit of mass that is not fat, that is actually metabolically active. So there's a bunch of different reasons, but I do want to come back and double click a little bit on the myostatin for a second, because we've seen pictures of those like Belgian blue cows.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly,
so what is this myostatin?
So myostatin, I don't want to forget, because you hit an important topic, which is the role of muscle tissue in pumping blood. I want to get back to that too.
Okay, I'll write that down.
Yeah, let's talk about myostatin. So myostatin is a protein that we make that actually suppresses the ability to produce and grow and hypertrophy your muscle tissue. The Belgian blue bull, which is this grazing animal that develops massive muscle, well defined. I mean, they look like they look like you. They look like you walking around the field there. The bottom line is that myostatin, if you eliminate it, allows your muscle to grow sort of unchecked. So every time you load your muscle, you'll get a what's called an anabolic response. You'll actually build muscle tissue. So Belgian blue bulls are an example of what's called a myostatin knockout. Well, it turns out that if you block myostatin, you can get the same benefit. You can actually build muscle at a much higher and efficient rate than you can under normal circumstances. And people say, well, why do we have myostatin? Well, the reason you have myostatin is that when you actually reach your maximum skeletal mass, if you keep building muscle tissue, you literally can break your own bones. So a stress fracture, which is a repetitive muscle contraction injury, literally can break a bone, can put a hairline fracture into bone. So in order to avoid that, because in evolution, if you had a stress fracture walking through the savannah, you'd be the victim of predation, right? You'd be a lion's lunch that day. Well, the truth is that myostatin can be controlled, and one of the things we worked on was a natural counteracting protein called follistatin. And follistatin, which you find in very high doses in eggs, actually can help inhibit and suppress myostatin activity and help build muscle. That's why eggs are such a cornerstone of good nutrition.
Holy cow, that's wild. So I've heard of like some docs doing like follistatin gene therapy and things like that.
They're doing that now.
Is that the concept? So is it more so a muscle-centric treatment, or are there other sort of umbrella aspects of it?
Great question. So I think that people are focused on follistatin as kind of an antidote to too much myostatin.
Okay.
And so it's going to be a target for developing therapeutics. And by the way, there have been companies which have tried to make myostatin antagonists in order to help build muscle to treat things like cancer, cachexia, and wasting and age-related frailty. The problem is most of those drug approaches are very irreversible. And irreversible myostatin inhibition is associated with certain adverse effects. In contrast, if follistatin is simply a component of your nutrition and you're using it to counteract elevated levels of myostatin, you could get the benefits without the downside. And what you were talking about before, which is so important, people don't often recognize, aside from the synthetic behavior of muscle is an auxiliary pump system. Do you know that our heart requires a preload, just like any pump? You have a bilge pump in your boat, right? If you don't prime that pump with a preload of water, the pump will fail. If you don't pump blood up from your lower extremities, since we're bipedal organisms, we walk around, our blood pools in our lower extremities. By walking, by exercising the muscles of your lower extremities, you're actually augmenting the preload to your heart. You're reducing the work it has to do. And so the bottom line is muscle tissue as a blood pumping, blood support, cardiovascular support system is critically important. You are absolutely right about that.
Yeah, I don't think people think of it like that. And not to mention, I mean, if we touch on even the lymphatic system for a minute too,
Exactly.
Right? Like I remember way back in the day when I was like just getting things started, I was fascinated by the fact that like foam rolling had an impact on lymphatic drainage, right? It blew my mind. That was one of the things that I don't want to say got me interested in this world, but it's something that isn't taught in school. Let's put it that way, right? Like you don't think of it like that. You think the body inherently has everything and you don't think like, oh, okay, well, movement is actually moving this lymphatic fluid through my body. And maybe that's one of the reasons why I feel better after I move, right? Versus being stagnant.
That's why massage works, right?
Yep.
So I'll tell you something else that people don't often recognize. I mentioned before, muscle makes up this huge amount of your body mass, which means it's the largest venous capacitance organ in your body. What I mean by that is all the low pressure blood vessels on the venous side of the circulation in your muscle tissue, that's a huge volume of your circulating blood resides there. Now, what does that mean? Since they're low pressure vessels, that's where your immune system and your stem cells actually sequester. They stick to the walls of the blood vessels. And by sticking to the walls of the blood vessels, they're kind of ready. They're like in the pit, ready to be re-trafficked and transited to serve the body where needed. So they respond to signals like inflammatory signals, right? They respond to signals like metabolic signals. And then they migrate from that muscle tissue, from the venous side of muscle tissue, into the large vein of the body, back to the heart, and then distributed throughout the body again. So that's how a lot of our immune cells and stem cells find their way into the rest of your body to fix you.
So, I mean, this may be too cavalier to say, but does someone that has more healthy muscle tissue have more like stem cell potential?
I certainly believe that.
Yeah.
I think that healthy muscle tissue is the perfect place for stem cells to sit marginating. That means sticking to the walls of the blood vessels, marginating in the venous side of the circulation. They are able to release upon the reception of chemical signals, and then they'll get back into the circulation, and then they'll go and traffic to the place they have to go to. And so the healthier your muscle tissue, the more room you have for those stem cells to sequester. So that's a good thing. It's like it's like the on-deck circle.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I mean, I talk to people that, let's say they get, I've got two friends, and they're perfect example, polar examples. One friend works on a farm. He's an avid bow hunter. The guy is just always moving. Every possible thing happens to the guy because he'll get run over by a tractor one day. He'll, get rabies another day. And I'm not exaggerating. Like the dude, everything happens to him. And he did something to his arm where they wanted him to immobilize his arm. And he was like, well, screw that. I'm not immobilizing my arm. So he let it be immobilized for a short amount of time. And then he was back in the gym in like a day, and he was supposed to be in this. And his recovery was almost miraculous with how fast, right? Compare that to another friend that had an injury with his leg, and he'd followed everything that was, he kept it immobilized. Recovery was, there was a less significant injury than the gentleman that had the arm injury, and his recovery. So I have had this theory in my mind that it's like maybe he was also a heavily muscled person. He was moving. He probably had these myokines, these exerkines that actually helped potentiate the stem cells more. All of this, I'm speculating. Full disclaimer, right? This is speculation on my end. But I've seen this. I'm like, okay, he moved. He moved this large body of mass. Was it affecting his stem cells? Was it affecting his recovery and his repair? I'm inclined to think so, but who knows?
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah. I think you're right on target. In fact, everything points to the reality that your health and your ability to combat acquired problems like age-related frailty, things like that, is dependent upon how many healthy stem cells you can muster to respond to the natural processes and to any emergency. So it's funny, you mentioned the fact that your buddy went from being immobilized and saying, I'm not going to do that, to being very mobile. So I'll tell you something. Think about the way medicine was just 20, 30 years ago. If you had a heart attack, what was the first thing they recommended? Bed rest.
Yeah.
We don't do that anymore.
No.
In fact, after major cardiac surgery, patients are walking
they want them to
the
walk.
night
Yep.
of the surgery. We know for a fact mobility is essential to kind of circulating all of those things. And I will guarantee you it has a lot to do with making available that reservoir of stem cells that you need to effectuate a repair and a recovery. So I think your intuition's right on.
Yeah. Well, and I also just like muscle and think it's cool. So, all right. So I want to move into the next one. I mean, we could realistically go on for probably a couple hours on that, and maybe we should. But I want to move to the second pillar, which was cognition, which I think we're seeing that more and more and more now. It's interesting what I've noticed in the era of social media and where we're at now is I feel like the average person is getting to a point where they're a little bit tired of the usual fat loss, muscle building type of content and things like that. And maybe they're seeing that maybe we've reached the limits of what the physical body can do without actually looking at the cognitive piece. So with that, I'm seeing, okay, there's a lot more interest in cognitive health, cognitive performance, just cognition in general. So where does that stand in the pillar when it comes down to longevity?
So, I saw a statistic, I don't know if it's accurate or not, that in the array of supplements people have available to them, the growth in the use of cognitive enhancing supplements, neurotropics and ketone supporting agents, all driving higher cognitive performance, is exploding. People are saying, okay, I think I got my muscle and my mitochondria, I have that under control. Now I want to do something that's going to enhance the performance of my brain and spinal cord, because that's really where the rubber hits the road in terms of quality of life, right? I mean, we can be physically and metabolically in great shape, but if we have a declining ability to calculate, to communicate, to integrate and exchange with our environment, that's where things really start to go downhill. So there's no doubt in my mind that one of the great benefits of taking care of muscle and your metabolic system is you create an environment that enhances cognitive performance. I think you mentioned it before. The underlying metabolic environment the brain has to function in is very sensitive. Oxygen is a big issue, right? The state of whether you've got ketones fueling your brain versus carbohydrates or glucose. There's no doubt that your cognitive performance is enhanced under conditions that we used to think are not positive. So starvation, for example. When you starve yourself, you will find 24 hours in, there's a mental clarity that comes over things. Now, if it works well acutely, right, short-term starvation benefits cognition. What about building that into an overall program to enhance brain performance during your lifetime? And so, you and I both kind of are watching around us. People are focusing more on decreasing or increasing the interval between consuming food, right? And they're trying to create a state that drives them more towards ketosis. Ketosis has certain benefits, and that creates lots of dividends. Some of the dividends are enhanced muscle performance, which we know produces myokinome proteins, which help the brain, and we know that the metabolic system during ketosis actually is good for cognitive function. You can think more clearly, you get better blood flow to the brain, you get better utilization of energy in the brain. All those things are beneficial and translate into better calculation ability, communication ability, and exchange and interaction with your environment.
Yeah.
So those are all things that we need to start focusing on more acutely.
It's interesting when I look at if you look at ketosis as sort of like, I don't know, if you had a bucket and ketosis is at the bottom of the bucket, right? And you have to get through all the fuel to ultimately get there. Let's just very terrible example, but for illustration purposes. I've heard a number of people talk about it like this that are well respected. And it's almost as though the closer you're getting to ketosis, not necessarily nutritionally or anything, and I'll explain and elaborate more in a second, the better you are for metabolic health. Now, the way that I can elaborate on this is when we exercise. we're getting ourselves closer to that state, right? So it's not even like we're saying, hey, everyone needs to go on a ketogenic diet or everyone needs to be in ketosis, but there is something to be said, or at least acknowledged or investigated more, that the closer that we get to that, even for regular people, the better, right? So I come from the school of thought of, okay, get up in the morning, train fasted. You don't have to be eating a ketogenic diet and you're probably going to be flirting with ketosis, right? Like you may not be full bore, but you're probably producing some ketones. Even a regular person that ate at 7 p.m. the night before, they're fasted, they go and they train. Once their glycogen stores are somewhat depleted, or at least their liver glycogen, they're probably flirting with ketosis, right? And they're not doing a ketogenic diet. They could be eating 400 grams of carbs per day, right?
That's right.
It's just the more that we can kind of allow ourselves to dip our toe in that water.
I like that. That's the way to think about it.
Yeah. I think that's there's something there. And then since you're a brain guy, I figured I'd ask you, what about the effect of lactate from exercise on the brain?
So the military, many, many years ago, in studying performance of special operatives, they wanted to make sure that if they've got a team that's climbing 3,000 foot of elevation to get to a forward operating base, and these guys are carrying 80-pound packs, is the metabolic and is it lactate generation that's occurring during this highly aerobic exercise, is when they get to the top of the mountain, are they able to perform in a firefight? And so they actually looked at cognitive performance, and believe it or not, all the things you would assume are associated with driving someone's metabolic performance into almost an anaerobic state. What does that do to actual cognitive function? And they found that it actually improves it. And so, maybe a lot has to do with a lot of the coincident or collateral hormonal effects, like on adrenaline and so on. All of these things improve circulation to the brain. They improve oxygen consumption and delivery to the brain, and they tend to shift you into this temporary or more prolonged state of ketogenesis, which again appears to have real benefits in cognitive performance. And so, I think we're going to learn in the next several years, because of the concentration on this, we're going to learn a lot more on two things. Glucose deprivation, keeping glucose out of your system, because we all know glucose drives your system in the wrong direction. Yeah. And if you can consume the fat stores you have, which drive a better form of energy for brain function, that should result in not only temporary increased brain performance, but I believe even long-term improved cognitive function. That's why exercise may be if you have an early diagnosis of evolving dementia, put that individual on a program of exercise. Even walking, even slow entry into the walking, and then load the walking, right? It doesn't have to be either load with elevation, so that you're walking at an incline, or load with actual weight. Those things begin to pay all the dividends for cognitive performance as well as general metabolic function.
And just the sheer ability to use, fuel substrate sort of utilization and partitioning, right? I work with special forces operators, specifically with the Army, and that is one of the reasons that I was brought in, was mainly because of my work in the ketogenic field, and they were interested in that piece. But as time went on, it quickly evolved into this thing of, I don't necessarily like the word metabolic flexibility, but I'm going to use it. And the reason I don't like it is because I think it's overused in an improper context, because metabolic flexibility can be achieved through proper training, right? You train both systems, you're going to become, but I do think that it can be heavily influenced nutritionally, but I'm going to side table that for a second. When I talk about substrate utilization, if let's just say, in the case of these special forces operators, they are utilizing more fats during this aerobic time. They've become more efficient at fat utilization. Well, one would say, well, the brain doesn't use fats. Okay, that's a fair point. But you're also having a glucose sparing effect, and the brain does use glucose. So if you can condition your body from the head down to be more effective at utilizing fats, then isn't that going to spare glucose for the brain? So you're not having to waste that glucose on your physical body climbing up the hill if you can use fat at a slightly higher intensity. Therefore, you're preserving glucose utilization for the brain. So no one's denying that the brain is a glucose hog and that the brain needs glucose. Yes, the brain can run on ketones, but let's say independent of a ketogenic state,
Right.
the brain's going to run on glucose, right? So, I mean, you're sparing glucose for the brain rather than sucking it up into your quadricep because you are a terrible fat oxidizer. Does that make sense at all?
It does. Yeah. And I think you're hitting on an important point, which is the brain is part of a system, right? And the general system, metabolically creates conditions in different organs and tissues that favor the preferred metabolic pathway of that tissue. And you're 100% right. The brain likes glucose because it's a fast energy source, right? But at the same time, how it gets that glucose and how it partitions the systemic availability of glucose is important. And that's why driving a state of fat utilization that frees up glucose, like you pointed out, has tremendous benefits for acute brain function, and simultaneously helps drive the overall system to driving energy where it has to go. If you need to think and perform, and you also have to do that while you're carrying a 80-pound pack and walking up a mountain, you need to be feeding both systems, right? The brain has to be fed its preferred source of energy, and muscle needs its preferred source of energy.
And if we scale that down, because people might be thinking, well, I'm not carrying an 80-pound pack. Okay, well, if your same intensity load or metabolic load, if we scale that down to a 70-year-old individual that isn't carrying an 80-pound pack, but they're just trying to go up a flight of stairs, and they lose cognitive function when they're at the top of the stairs because they're not metabolically efficient, don't have the ability to switch substrates and yada, yada. It's the same context, right? Yeah. You're taking an extreme population where it might be you have the opportunity to study that cohort, which might give you some unique insights in an accelerated way, which is what I love about working with those guys too, is it's just like they'll do anything. It's a great cohort. Like they're awesome. Yep. But you can't, good luck finding that cohort in the real world, but it's going to happen. It's going to be just a scaled system of it, just a lower scale, because that same intensity in someone that's out of shape, it's all relative.
And talk about the moment of clarity guys have at the peak of their exercise performance, right? They do in fact talk about just being able to think more clearly. Vision tends to improve. The thought that extreme exercise causes a decline in cognitive function, we just don't see it. And particularly in like the special operatives that you're talking about, these operators, they're athletes, and so their system's already designed to kind of, like you said, kind of be flexible, malleable when it comes to what they drive and use for energy and what they basically do to store for the next challenge they're going to have.
No, exactly. I mean, I have all my great thoughts of world domination after I've deadlifted 405 and ran 800 meters. All right, so the next pillar that you mentioned was immunity, inflammation, that whole piece. And how does that come into play when we're talking longevity?
So we now recognize that, and I used to say many, many years ago, if you think of aging as a clock, right? Inflammation is the sweep second hand on the clock. It never stops. It just keeps going around and around and around. You can change the pace by decreasing inflammation, and that should allow your clock to run longer. But the bottom line is we now think of aging as a chronic inflammatory process.
It's inflammaging, right? We've actually
inflammaging, exactly. The phrase has been coined. And so there's no doubt that many of these strategies people are using today to defeat or slow the process of aging is applying what we know to be anti-inflammatory nutritional strategies, anti-inflammatory sort of environmental systemic strategies, things like hypothermia, right? Has a very important role in controlling inflammation peripherally and ultimately systemically. And then clearly making certain that you're not taking into your body anything which has its own tendency to promote inflammation. That is being seen as critically important to controlling the aging process.
So can you describe, and I've talked about this in other videos, but there's hundreds of them out there, so people don't always see that stuff. Like, what is inflammation? Can you describe like damage-associated molecular patterns and some of these things as well that sound scary and complicated, but when you boil it down, they're not that complicated for the basic discussion.
So let's make certain that everybody recognizes inflammation is a process that we need for responding to the continued barrage of insults that we absorb in every cell and tissue of our body. And inflammation is responsible for the demolition process that precedes renovation. So I often talk about, and I talk about it in the context of stem cells, that we are continually going through a renewal and remodeling process. Inflammation is a driver of all of that because it's responsible for targeting things that need to be cleaned out and ultimately replacing them by recruiting in cells to remodel. And so, interestingly, inflammation can be thought of as an imbalance between demolition and repair. That's the way I think about it. So recently I've gotten, well, it's not really recent. For me, it's recent in my old age. For the last 10 years, I've been very focused on the role and importance of senescent cells and how senescent cells need to be a target of therapy. So it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. We're 25, 30 trillion cells. The vast majority of our cells have been developed from a population of stem cells that came in to replace some cells that kind of lost their functionality. So people say, well, what's a senescent cell? A senescent cell is a cell that, as a consequence of age and chronic damage, loses the ability to divide, and it starts to take on a phenotype, a form, that produces very abnormal peptides and proteins, many of which drive inflammation. Now, senescent cells play a role. We evolve as organisms by some cells doing their job, dying off and being eliminated once they become senescent. But as we get older, the system necessary to clear senescent cells starts to function abnormally. So years ago, I spent a lot of time focused on a cell type called the natural killer cell. The natural killer cell is a white blood cell that's specialized to have what we call innate activity, meaning that it's pre-programmed to perform certain functions. Some of the most important functions it performs is to target the expression of certain markers on cells that are kind of like a red flag. The red flag says, hey, there's something wrong with me. I've been infected with a virus. There's something wrong with me. I've got a transformation and I'm a cancer cell. Or something's wrong with me. I'm a senescent cell. Those stress ligands or stress molecules that are expressed on the surface of cells are the red flag that natural killer cells hunt down and destroy. And so clearing senescent cells is in large part due to the efficiency of our natural killer cell system. But it turns out that as we get older, some of those NK cells may be effective at killing the senescent cell, but they don't clear the senescent cell. So I termed a descriptor called senoablation. What it really means is not just killing a senescent cell, but clearing it out as well. If you don't clear a senescent cell out, it takes up space and you can't replace it. So let's say in 10,000 muscle cells in one small piece of your muscle tissue, if you've got 100 senescent cells, if I don't kill them and clear them out, I can't rebuild that muscle with new cells.
So you can kill them, and then what you do? Things like fasting, things like that are probably good at clearing them.
Exactly. Yeah. We hear this term autophagy. Yeah. Autophagy is the process of clearing out the dead wood. Yeah. And by the way, in biology, we know that the process of pruning is important. Do you have any rose bushes in your house?
No, I don't. I don't like the thorns. No, not at our house, but I'm familiar with a rose bush.
Yeah. Rose bushes, fruit trees. You have to periodically prune these different agricultural species. You've got to get rid of the dead wood. You've got to clear out, or else you don't get normal functional repair and replacement. Now, pruning is critically important to a fruit tree being able to produce a bigger and bigger a crop every season. The same thing happens in the human body. we need to prune our tissues and get rid of the dead wood, and that's driven by these natural killer cells. So you need two things for healthy demolition and repair. You need a very effective senoablatant, and your natural killer cells are that senoablatant. That's one of the things we do at my company is develop technology around that. And then you have to have a healthy population of replacement cells. And those are the stem cells that reside in your tissues that they're called upon, they're signaled to come and replace that cell that's just been cleared by the NK cell. So there's a cadence to good regenerative therapy. There's a cadence. The first thing is get rid of the senescent cells by using a senoablatant, a natural senoablatant, and then replace the senescent cell with a healthy stem cell derived differentiated form. That's what gives you and allows you to restore the quality and function of your organs and tissues during your lifetime.
That is so wild. I mean, and just to be clear, just for people, fasting is not the only way to induce more autophagy. I just want to be clear on that. Obviously, it is an accelerator, but exercise induces autophagy tremendously. There's a lot of different ways. Now, I am biased as someone that enjoys fasting, and I definitely know the literature is there. I think when you start looking, and I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, a lot of the literature that the mainstream will look at regarding fasting is looking at pretty short-term fasting, where the degree of autophagy is not, it's significant, but not anything crazy, right? You're going to compare that to exercise and it's going to be, okay, I'll just exercise rather than not eat. But when you start getting 24, 36, 48 hours, that number does increase, right. Because it isn't just I always say it's not a light switch on or off, it's a dimmer switch. And if you're accelerating it more with more fasting for a longer period of time, it is going to be an accelerated state of autophagy because you are, and this will satisfy a lot of the people that maybe might only look at it from a sheer calories in, calories out. You're putting yourself into a deeper deficit. So, right. And then perhaps even movement during said fast puts you into even deeper deficit, right? So the deeper the deficit to a degree, the higher some of this signaling for clearing out. Again, to an extent. I'm sure you could stress yourself too much too.
Yeah, there are no absolutes, right? Yeah. Everything has got, like you say, a rheostat attached to it.
Yep.
Dial up or dial down something in order to get the maximum benefit. But it's interesting. Autophagy is a phenomenon that is not only critical to maintaining the quality of your tissues and organs during your lifetime.
Yeah, it's like comparing us to, life expectancy, 2,000 years ago was significantly less. Okay, well, we also didn't eliminate some of the threats that now we've eliminated those threats, right? Or if you go back 10,000 years and you've got however long saber-toothed tigers were alive, right? Right. Eliminate that threat, you're going to increase longevity, right? Or increase lifespan. So it's just, a lot of it is just the elimination of a threat. Lastly, moving on to the aesthetics piece, which we touched on for a second in the beginning, but I want to hear more about this. How is this such a strong pillar for longevity?
So, I got to give my plastic surgery colleagues a lot of credit. I remember in medical school, we kind of all partitioned into guys who were going to, go into surgery versus internal medicine, psychiatry, and so on. The surgeons kind of broke themselves into two different categories. Some of the guys, the cowboys like myself, who wanted to do things like trauma and neurosurgery and so on. And then the guys who were really artists, and they wanted to use their skills to improve the physical form of the human body. And these guys chose things like plastic, aesthetic, reconstructive surgery. And what they learned, and by the way, we owe them a debt of gratitude because they taught us a lot about stem cells along the way. But what we learned is that when people have a negative image of themselves, and a big part of that has to do with physical appearance, anything you can do to correct and improve that pays tremendous benefits and dividends in terms of mental state, and that actually affects the immune system, and it affects exercise tolerance, cognitive performance. And so I've become very sensitive to the fact that preservation of youthful aesthetics will in fact create benefits that translate into an impact on lifespan. I'll give you a perfect example. I bet you, and I don't think anybody's done the work, and maybe I'm going to prime my plastic surgery and dermatology colleagues to think about this. I bet you if you look at the impact of long-term regular use of things like Botox, I bet you it's associated with a gain in overall health span, because people perform better when they have a level of sort of mental state, a high quality mental state associated with youthful aesthetics. And it's interesting. A colleague of mine once talked about, if you in your mind perceive yourself as youthful, regardless of your age, you will live longer than if you perceive yourself as elderly. And that makes a lot of sense to me. And so the aesthetic side of the equation matters.
Yeah, well, it comes back to the self-talk, which sounds woo-wooey, but it's very real, because when the rubber hits the road on it, it's real. You guys that hit 30 and they say, okay, well, it's just because I'm 30, like this is changing, or I hit 40 and this is changing because I'm 40. Okay. Yes, maybe, but like, do you want to keep calling yourself 40, or what do you want to call yourself? Because at the end of the day, like, you're living in the second, and the more that you focus on that, it's interesting. If you, I can speak for myself. I would rather be in my own gym where I can train with my shirt off and see what I look like.
Right.
It's not about, I don't want to go to a gym and take my shirt off for everyone else to see me with my shirt off. I train in a dungeon by myself early in the morning. I don't give a crap. I want to see myself, because that is my driver when I say, okay, all right, Thomas, like, you look good, you're in shape, you look young, you look the way you want to be. I train harder. If I didn't like how I looked, it doesn't make me train harder. It doesn't. Like, people think like, okay, you get this catalyst there, this like trigger of like, maybe if you have a call to action at that particular moment in time where you look at yourself, you're like, what have I become? Oh my gosh, I got to crack a whip on myself. But most of the time, day after day after day, if you look at yourself and you don't like what you see, you're not going to train harder through that. You're going to typically be demotivated. And I see this a lot with women, right? It's a huge one with women. I think guys see it too. They don't necessarily articulate it, because that's going to sound weird for a guy to just be like, oh, I don't want to train hard because I don't like how I look. In reality, it's probably happening in their head. They're just not vocalizing it. Like, my wife is certainly that way. She'll be like, I want to stay covered up because I don't even want to see myself right now. I'm like, you look amazing. And she's, no, I don't. Like, I doesn't like how she looks, so she won't want to train in front of the mirror. She's not the only one. That's happening on repeat with that radio voice in the head too.
People set their own barometer, right? They set their own expectations, and just in any society, you're going to have those perfectionists who will always keep moving the bar up and up and up, and then you'll have certain people who set very achievable goals, and when they reach them, it's a motivator to set the next achievable goal. But the bottom line is that, like you, I agree. Personal improvement based upon physical exercise should be driven by your own personal objectives and your own personal measures. It shouldn't be that you're looking for reinforcement from outside, because that's always, let's be honest with you, you like someone like yourself who has worked so hard to be in such great physical condition. Wherever you go, there's always going to be somebody who thinks that they're in better shape, right?
Yeah, or is, and there's always going to be someone bigger, leaner, smarter,
and they set a more critical set of standards than you would ever set for yourself. But bottom line is, I just think that maintaining youthful aesthetics does two fundamental things. It eliminates the tendency for people in a competitive environment from beginning to be dismissive because they think that someone is old and beyond their peak performance. And that's one thing. So just being able to maintain a level of aesthetic quality gives you the opportunity to compete against other age groups. That's one thing. The other thing is that I do think that there's an important improvement in mental health that's associated with your own positive reinforcement from how you are monitoring the way you're preserving and maintaining your physical appearance. I think those things benefit people. And like I said, the reason that you see so much money being invested in dermatology and in aesthetic products and in plastic surgery is because people do derive a clear and measurable benefit that affects their mental health, their overall state, and obviously their ability to compete in their little communities.
Yeah, and this is not to be confused with the unrealistic expectations that are set on social media. This is, you're based on your own goals and even personal beliefs. This one time, this person asked me, this was about 10 years ago, okay, where do I start? Like, I'm a very unmotivated person, but knew he needed to make a change. And I actually was kind of taken aback. I'm like, I don't really know how to answer this question. Where do you start? And like, without really thinking about it, the first thing I said was, because he was a really, really pale person. I was like, go get a tan. Like, I don't care. Just go get a tan or go get some sun or do something. Yeah. He's like, go get a tan. I was like, just do it. And like, I was like, just like step one, like you're going to look more defined. You're going to look better if you just have a little bit of a tan. Like and I was like, after he left, I was like, that was weird. I don't know what I said to that guy. But whatever. He comes back to me a couple of weeks later and he's just like, that worked. He's like, I saw that I did have the top abs. I just needed some sun and I needed like a little bit of a tan. And he's like, I looked better. My complexion looked better. And it just gave me that extra little edge that I needed to start. And I was like, you know what? There's something to that. And it was at that point that I realized like this random answer that I gave this guy came from somewhere. I didn't just, I'm just like, do the first easiest path of least resistance step for you to look a little bit better. So you look at yourself a little bit differently, say, oh, okay, maybe I'm not as much as a pasty slob like I thought I was, And then all of a sudden he's like, and 3 months later, the guy's in amazing shape. It was like what he needed.
The first step's the hardest, right?
Yeah.
First step's always the hardest. And it's interesting because people don't necessarily understand what steps they need to take to derive measurable benefits. People, it's funny. I was talking to somebody the other day. It's very difficult to get tangible benefits in short-term bursts of activity. Yeah. You really got to have staying power. And so the nice thing about getting a tan, at least it lasts a while. Yeah, right?
True.
And so, that by the way, it's great advice. I'm going to start telling everybody that there is, and by the way, we live in a world where sun exposure is so controversial. Yeah. But the bottom line is there's other ways to maintain a glow, a skin appearance that gives you those benefits. And that may be enough to push you over the edge to want to do that extra set in the gym, to want to, cut out that unnecessary Krispy Kreme donut, things like that.
No, I'm with you, man. Well, Dr. Hariri, where can everyone find you, man?
So look, I'm thrilled to be here, and I'd love anyone interested in what we're doing to look at my blog, which is on pilotinghealth.com. They can also follow me on all my social media at Dr. Bob Hariri. That's Hariri. The first name is easier for people to get. And then my company's Cellularity, which is my therapeutics company, is CELULARITY.com. And then Fountain Life, our clinic system that Tony, Peter, and I have created, is fountainlife.com. So would love people to reach out and happy to help in any way.
Absolutely. And I'll link out to all those below.
Thank you.
Bob, thanks so much, man.
Thanks, Tom.